will be sent to you via HCA. So I'm going to ask that you look out for that in your email. Today, I'm certainly presenting this training accompanied by Emily Bance. Emily Bance is a lecturer in and Emily's waving, in our School for Health Professions, and she's also part of our team. I am Earl Leach, and I'm the Senior Training Consultation Specialist with the Rutgers School for Health Professions. And we are pleased to be presenting this training to you today. So let's get acquainted. I see quite a number of folks have already indicated where they're from in the state of Washington, and it's always a geography lesson for me. So I am learning a whole lot and hopefully get a chance to visit some of these sites. So we have Teresa from Everett, and I certainly wouldn't be able to call everyone. I'll just note a few. We have Washington. I'm trying to think, who else do we have? Tacoma, Washington. We have Spokane, Tacoma, Tacktown. That's interesting. Hi, Derek, how are you? We have, fantastic. Ocean Shores. So we have quite a few people from across the region. Plymouth Housing. Thank you all for participating today. And continue to put your geographic location in the comments if you haven't done so already. It gives us a sense as to where we are. And certainly in the process. So let's review the learning application. I know in a second training that was done by Shelley Buckbinder, the other member of our team, we last asked folks in the culmination of that particular training to do some learning application. Can you tell me who was able to use the wellness worksheet with a client? And what information did you learn about the client from using the worksheet? And are there any particular questions or concerns? So if you have had the opportunity to do so, certainly let us know. And I will take a look to see if anyone has. You can certainly share those in the comment section. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to try to move us as quickly as we can along. I am seeing here that Jan, you were able to, when the patient identified that she was not meeting spiritual values. Great. Any particular intervention or approaches you took that in response to that particular comment, Jan, if you can? Okay. She identified her goals and made a commitment to interact with nature more. That's fantastic, certainly. To get a chance to really identify an area of unmet needs and to take a look at what strategies or approaches she's going to take to address that. So that's fantastic. And thank you so much, Jan, for sharing. Anyone has any specific questions related to that particular application or feedback as to how they would apply it in the future? And you certainly can share those in the comment section. Lisa says, I learned more about the client. Client was receptive and open to the strategy and have a guideline. It seemed like a lot to cover in one visit for the client. We will split it up. Absolutely. And certainly you can do this ongoingly in terms of a fluid process. And I think at every stage, you probably have a chance to really revisit this particular worksheet. So do continue to utilize it. But great work. So our learning objectives for today, and I want to make sure that we are focused on those, is to recognize factors that determine readiness in the stages of change, and to describe the rationale for using the knowledge, skills, and resources formed in the service plan development. And we'll talk some more about that, but that's very critical to the process of moving from assessment to treatment planning to the service delivery. And to break down the steps of a goal by using the KSR form, which is the knowledge, skills, and resources form. So that's our learning objectives for today. As usual, what we do is that we go throughout the training series, each stage to determine where in the golden thread we are focusing on for this particular training. So in the early two trainings, we certainly looked at the engagement process, assessing medical necessities, assessing strengths and needs. And today we're looking at identifying the personal goals and some of the goal and ISP plans. So we'll look at how that shifts from training to training as we go through the entire thread, which is referred to as the golden thread, which is critical to the foundational community services. So please, I think this particular slide or this particular handout we put in a separate one so that you can use it to kind of keep track of where you are throughout the trainings along the golden thread. So from identified goals to the knowledge, skills, and resources, the commencement point is certainly the comprehensive assessment. And from that comprehensive assessment, it leads to the goal identification based on the values, value roles, unmet needs, and strengths. And this is important to note because today we're going to ensure that we focus primarily on those components of basically setting up that platform and that bridge to move from the comprehensive assessment to goal identification. And that includes the valued role, life roles that we talked about last week, unmet needs, and the strengths that that particular consumer or the person you're working with bring to the table. So it's about really establishing who that person sees themselves or wanting to attain as their valued self, their best self. What particular unmet need that is bringing them into service, and the strengths that they're bringing, those resilience, those things that they've learned to help them through the process of goal attainment. So those are three components that are critical to really establishing a meaningful goal-oriented approach to the service. So from that comprehensive assessment, understanding the valued life roles, unmet needs, and strengths, we're then looking to determine that person's readiness to change, where that person is in the process of determining what action they need to engage in next to get along the way to the goal. So we're exploring interest in making a change. What is important to note is that at any point during this process, oftentimes people, particularly the commencement point, people have a sense as to how ready they are, how committed they are to work towards that goal. But like anything else, they may not necessarily be at that point when you're engaging with them, ready to actually actualize, ready to actually work specifically on that goal. So we have to determine where that person is in the readiness state to determine what interventions and actions are necessary or are appropriate to move that person along with the right level of motivation. And the stages of change will help you determine the strategies for engaging that person. So once we're able to establish where that person is in the change process and how ready they are, then we establish specific interventions associated with that stage of change. And we'll talk some more about that. So once we were able to establish that person's readiness, where they are in that process of change, then we look specifically at the knowledge, skills, and resources that they bring or they need to acquire to get towards that goal, to be able to really be in the right state of motivation and have the right skill set, the right knowledge base, and the right resources in order to really activate their movement, activate their energy towards really attaining that goal, or to consciously pursue that goal. So please take a conscientious look at the trajectory from the comprehensive assessment, and we look at the value, life roles, unmet needs and strength. We're able to then establish where that person is in terms of readiness for change. And then we need to establish what knowledge, skills, and resources are going to be acquired or going to be further enhanced from what they bring in order to help them pursue that goal. So our next action is the factors that really determine that readiness. And that's important to get a sense of. So let's first look at felt need. So it's felt need, and we'll talk specifically about what felt need is. Commitment, the internal knowledge, and the external knowledge. So these are the factors that determine readiness, because it's easy to simply say someone is either ready or not, but what are those specific factors? What are those visible or clearly defined factors that really give you a sense as to that person's readiness, or able to help that person determine their own state of readiness? And what commitments do they bring to actually working on it? What knowledge they bring from their own self, who they are, where they are in their life, and what knowledge they must attain or gain from the environment or about the environment to help them be able to really pursue that goal. So felt needs. In essence, felt need is talking about that person's level of disdain, dislike, or dissatisfaction with their current circumstances. So when we're talking about the felt need, we're talking about what is it that person wants, desires, that is not present in their current circumstance. And that drives that person's readiness, in essence. So it's moving from a state of dissatisfaction with your current circumstances to the pursuit of a satisfactory circumstance that will enable that person to feel motivated to move towards goals. So gauging one's commitment. This is fundamental to the process in the sense that without that level of commitment, the pursuit of that goal or that person's drive towards meeting that unmet need is going to always be challenged or hampered if there isn't that level of commitment. So we're talking about that person's belief, that internal, intrinsic concept that things are possible. And that not only are they possible, but they're going to be positive once they get to that end goal. Hello. So these are very significant philosophical beliefs and concepts that are going to drive internally that person's action and motivation in the pursuit of their goals. So I think it's important to remember we're looking at a scheme that really reminds us that it's about that person that we're working with and where they are, what their motivations are, so that we're aiding them and supporting them in that process. So it's taking out that concept that we have to fix things. We have to do it all. We have to just be able to really decipher, are those factors, are those things in place already? Or how do we motivate that person to recognize and to maximize them? The internal knowledge, it's related to that person, who that person is, and how much are they committed to making the necessary changes to get to the outcome that they desire. And that's going to be further supplemented or complemented by the knowledge that they acquire related to the environment where that change will occur. what needs to change in their environment? What needs to happen? What is it they know about the circumstances in their environment that will help that change occur? So these are critical elements to be aware of when you are focusing with that person on any change action. So to determine the readiness, it is important to take a critical look at all these factors. As someone is in front of you, someone is engaging with you, you're trying to determine clearly where that person is in terms of readiness. So the felt needs, really that person's dissatisfaction with their circumstance, how committed they are in terms of, do they believe that this is possible and they can get to a positive outcome? What is it they bring from themselves as internal knowledge and resources, and what they know about the environment and the circumstances under which they're existing that is going to help them pursue that goal. So it's important to explore those factors and get some feedback about those factors as you pursue work with that person. Any questions there? Okay. So we'll take a look at a specific case opportunity so that we can try to really enact that sense of awareness, that categorization of factors. So let's look at Patricia. She's a 35-year-old woman living in Kennewick, Washington, and she'd previously worked in a Safeway for 3 years before a brief hospitalization. She's decided to return to work as it would help her financially, but she has expressed some ambivalence. So what's important to note here is Patricia, she previously worked for Safeway for 3 years. She had a brief hospitalization subsequently. She's decided to return to work. And it's all about helping her financially. So enhancing her financial status, but there is some ambivalence and uncertainty about whether or not she's going to be able to really negotiate that path towards getting back to work and making it a fulfilling pursuit and a sustained pursuit. So what is being asked here is, what is a question to ask that will help Patricia explore felt needs? And the felt needs, I take this opportunity to remind you, is about a dissatisfaction with her current circumstance. So what question would you ask Patricia to help you get an understanding as to how dissatisfied she is with her current circumstance? Interesting. Do you need full-time or part-time for income? It's a good question about, are you behind on rent? These are all poignant questions. But that's more so about the motivation for her pursuit of employment. What is your ambivalence about returning to work? Very good question. What are the things that has her in a dilemma? Why is she hesitant? What is a barrier? And remember, when we're asking these questions, as we focus on in the first and second trainings, it's about those open-ended questions that really motivate that person to give you more, to not have just yes or no. So we have to make sure they're open-ended questions. What is enticing about getting back to work? Why was she hospitalized? That evidence is not in place. So we have to just assume that, it was some kind of significant emotional or psychiatric impairment that led to that. So great questions. What are pros and cons of returning to work? Very good question. I think that's where we want to get. What are 3 things you wish would have been different about your job at Safeway? So we always start out, I would say, but tell me about what you like or dislike about your current situation. Remember, we're trying to focus on what is it that is currently not meeting that expectation or desire. So I think that's, you've kind of alluded to it in a sense of, tell me about what you like or dislike about your current circumstance. What would you like to what would it look like if you returned to work? To get a sense as to how is she seeing things as they would if the goal was met, as opposed to where they are currently. And how important it is for you to make that change. And I think you alluded to that when you were talking about, is that person behind on rent and so forth. So those are the things we're trying to garner. Those are the things we're trying to get some feedback from her about. Explore fear may be associated with return. Absolutely. How will this affect self-care? On the money. I think those are the things that we're trying to get. What is so dissatisfying about the current circumstances, and what have you uncertain about getting to that ends that you desire, which is getting back to work at Safeway? Very great response. Fantastic. So let's look at, next, we're going to look at the area of commitment. So what is a question you would ask Patricia about exploring her commitment? How would you go about getting a sense as to where she is in terms of commitment? And remember, the commitment is about the belief, that intrinsic belief about the possibility of the change and how positive it may be if attained. And someone said, and that's Elil, hoping I'm not butchering your name. What kind of work is she interested in? So how do we get to that person's belief? Great. And Michael said, if she believes she can handle her mental health symptoms while working. That's certainly on par. I think it's important to ascertain whether or not that person believes that they can manage their whole life, including work, and how work impacts that sense of wellness. Does she plan on returning to Safeway? What do you need to succeed? Renee. What accommodations does she believe would help with returning to work? Very good. So we're trying to decipher there. And I certainly agree with Gina. I like Rena's question about what it means, what are the concerns? So what we're trying to decipher more than anything else is about how that person is seeing the risk of returning to work. And how would they see this change impacting their lives? Richard have an interesting question. Is your need for money more important than your mental health? I think that's jumping into waters that may be challenging, because there may be, obviously she's established the need for the financial enhancement of pursuing work, while I'm assuming she's fully aware, given her most recent hospitalization, that there are some mental health challenges that can be managed or should be managed. How would working impact your valued life roles? Absolutely. What would returning to work look like? Linda, fantastic. I think you guys are on the money. And I see Seymour is asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want to work again? Yes, I think that kind of Likert scale, that kind of question really establishes clearly where that person's commitment would lie. So all very good responses. How can you overcome those concerns? Has she explored options that doesn't involve work? I think we want to focus certainly on her goal of pursuing work and then help her kind of decipher whether or not there is a reasonable conscientiousness about the risk and her willingness to take those risks. Very good responses. So let's now take a look at questions that we would ask Patricia potentially about exploring our internal knowledge. What is it about Patricia in particular? What does she bring that is going to impact her readiness? What about her can tell you and give her some insight as to her state of readiness? So what questions would you ask her to get a census to her internal knowledge? Interesting. What activities do you enjoy? What areas do you feel you excel? And I think that certainly lends itself to where we're trying to go. Sounds like you want to work. What personal strengths do you have that will help you succeed? Seymour, exactly on the money. And here Jared also says, what do you like about working? And those are the fundamental areas that we want to really explore. What types of strengths do you have? What is it about Patricia as a person? What is it she's bringing as a person that lends itself to a sense of, you know, where she is in terms of her readiness? What do you like? What do you like? Or what do you do with your free time? The pros and cons of working. I think you're all on the same highway that we're trying to travel, which is, what is the least or most important thing about this change? What interests you or disinterests you about this change? But ultimately, we're trying to get us to what's the most important thing for Patricia about making this change. And Jesse, that's pretty good. I didn't think about that, but that's a good area to explore. What have you learned about your skills and needs after this hospitalization? So I think that certainly lends itself to that person having awareness of the current circumstance, who they are, and how it's going to impact their sense of readiness. Great comments. So finally, let's look at what is a question you to ask her about external knowledge. And I think some of you have already kind of gone there, but let's ask, what questions would we ask in that particular area? So remember, the external knowledge is really information about the environment where that change happens. So what is it about her environment or circumstances she needs to change? Interesting. Are you, Lisa says, are you wanting to try a different type of career? How will you get to work? I think both of those are very good questions, because certainly understanding what challenges she may have to overcome to get to work certainly impacts the environment that she's stepping into work with. What education do you need for the job you want? What are the requirements of that job? And that's a good one. How does your environment support going back to work? Absolutely, Jared, on the money. I think certainly, if Linda's, we can assume certain things, but simply just recently leaving the hospital, really having a sense, trying to have a sense as to how she's going to adjust to the demands of work, and how her environment is going to impact her ability to sustain work. Let's talk about whether a job coach might be helpful. Linda, that is certainly a significant area to determine. Does she need supports to really help her make work a success? I would be interested to know whether anyone from her former job had expressed concern about ability to return to work and what she believed about that. That's an interesting question. With the sense that she either has a good relationship, we're hoping that she have a good relationship and she trusts the opinion of that person. And good question, Heather. I think certainly if we're able to get feedback from trusted sources about how we perceive, how they perceive our abilities or how we see ourselves through their eyes, may be helpful in many regards. What may be some boundaries you could set with an employer to support your well-being? Very good question. I would just probably modify that question in terms of the word and ask C. Fisher in terms of what kind of accommodations or support you need from your employer. Because when we're dealing with employers, we want to make sure that we are looking at it from a mutually supportive, mutually rewarding perspective. If children are involved, what about childcare? Good question, Lisa. So these are all, great questions in terms of really helping us get a sense and helping the client get a sense of their readiness as it relates to getting back to work. So fantastic job, everyone. I think you've all kind of really hit those areas. So once we have a sense as to that person's readiness, I want us to take a conscientious look at the stages of change. And I'm assuming some of you may be familiar with the stages of change. The stages of change is really the trans-theoretical concept of the stages of change. It starts with pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And as you would learn as we go along, these stages are fluid. So people can go, from one stage to the next and vacillate or move in between those stages. It doesn't have to be static. And in most instances, it isn't. So the stages of change are indeed fluid. And it's important to note, particularly when working with a consumer or a client that is dealing with multiple unmet areas of need, that the person may have different levels of motivation associated with different goals. A good example would be if someone is coming in with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder, that person, based on where they currently are, may be more focused or more motivated in working on their substance use stuff, the abstinence, in order to really get things back on track in other areas. So they may have a greater motivation around the substance use and may not have the same level of or different level of motivation around the mental health issues. So we have to be conscientious about that. And even if it's specific goals, it may be, if you think of someone that is dealing with diabetes, the person may have an interest in getting their blood sugar level to a certain point, but they may not be as motivated to drastically change their diet. So it may be, you may have to kind of work through as a balance that really helps that person attain or pursue both goals with an understanding that their sense of motivation may be different in different areas. What is critical and important to note is that based on these stages of change, your interventions should be shaped and designed to meet that person's stage of change. And we'll talk some more about that, what that looks like. So remember, the stages of change, it's important to note that people may be at different levels of motivation for different goals in terms of their stages of change, as well as what's important is that at any point, people may be, in some instances, between two stages of change. Somebody may be in preparation or action, and based on what day it is or what moment it is or what specific challenges they're working on. So pre-contemplation, we call the first stage, is basically a person being in a state where they don't see the need for a change. So they're not considering the change. And oftentimes we see most of our clients or most of our consumers at that point, particularly as it relates to an unmet need that is often driving them to service. Oftentimes people come to seek services for an unmet need, either by by being mandated or otherwise exploring a need for change because there's a force outside of themselves that is driving them in a direction and not necessarily have that internal motivation as yet. So what's contemplation in terms of the stages of change? That is where the person has some senses, yes, there's a problem, but I'm not certain I'm ready to work necessarily on that problem. So there's some ambivalence there. And I think that's a very critical time in which we can work with folks to really move the needle in the right direction. But it takes some strategic work, and the interventions really need to be pointed and designed to really support and assist that person in that stage of change. And we'll talk about what those interventions look like. But contemplation essentially is where that person understands that there's recognizes or is cognizant and aware that there's a problem, but they're still kind of weighing the pros and cons as to whether or not they want to change. And that's preparation. So we move from contemplation where that person acknowledges the problem, but they're still struggling with whether or not it's important or critical for them to make that change. Then we go into preparation, where that person acknowledges there's a need for a change and are now weighing the pros and cons. Is this important, or can this wait? Does this need to happen right now? And what are some of the barriers to change? What is it I have to deal with if I make this change? Like a good example I just gave in terms of the person with diabetes is, yes, I want my blood sugar to be down and not have to end up in the hospital or not be on insulin, but I'm not certain I want to give up my burgers and my sodas. So let me think about it for a moment. And oftentimes that's the preparation stage for people. And action, I think the word alludes to it very clearly. That's when the person is in the act of making that change and the behavior is new and they're trying to integrate that particular behavior into their daily lives. So it's really a tremendous amount of energy is required and focus and commitment. And maintenance is obviously where that person is trying to maintain that behavior and trying to do their very best not to resort back to the behaviors that were creating the unmet needs. So let's look at what interventions are associated specifically with the stages of change, keeping in mind that people may be in different stages or in between stages. So what kind of interventions are best suited for someone in pre-contemplation? We talk about really the biggest, most critical aspect of it in this stage is really working on that therapeutic relationship or that engaged relationship with that person. So developing that trust and that relationship so that you can work with that person on what is it that is preventing them from making that first step. So you provide some outreach and you do your very best to really do some practical supports. If we look at that person particularly with, let's look at the Patricia case in that particular case. If we're looking at Patricia's in pre-contemplation, we may want to, give Patricia some clear information about what it's like to work, what it's like to really be able to meet her financial needs. So it's really giving her as much information that allows her to then determine the level of importance and commitments that she's going to bring to it. And assessing really all the information, getting as much information as we can about the person, the circumstances, the environment, to help her really make an informed decision as to whether or not she wants to change. So those are the interventions that are associated with pre-contemplation. And contemplation and preparation, this is particularly the case where in most cases, people are somewhere in between these two stages of change. So oftentimes the interventions really are associated with both, can work for both. So you're talking about motivational interventions. We're talking about really helping that person find the internal strength, commitment, and validation to really determine the value of that change. And we provide as much information and education as we can to help them make an informed decision. So in contemplation or preparation or somewhere in between that, we try our very best to provide all those motivational techniques and inspire that person to find the value and importance of making the change for themselves. Because at the end of the day, this is about that person finding that incentive, that critical value to pursue that change for themselves. And in action, the interventions here are really, and we'll talk more about that, those knowledge, skills, and resources, but here it's about skill building. What is it this person needs to learn, needs to enhance or to improve upon to actually move them from where they are to where they want to be? Classic example in the Patricia case certainly is helping her understand or helping her build the skills. If we talk about it specifically in terms of getting to work, you know, being able to manage her symptoms while she's at work, being able to address and complete the task specific to the work. So those are some of the things we're talking about in terms of skill building. And then social supports. And I think you mentioned, someone mentioned that in the comments. What kind of support would Patricia need while at work or preparing to work or during the course of work to help her sustain? So we're talking about social supports, all the valued people, whether we're previous workers, whether we're healthcare, childcare folks, or peers that can help her really feel supported. And then we talk about cognitive behavioral interventions, helping her truly understand the impact of how you think and feel and how that impacts how you behave. So how do you deal with the fears or concerns about the risk of going back to work? And that's important. And then really helping her understand how that's impacting her commitment to engaging the behavior. How is that impacting her thoughts about her potential success at work? And what it's going to take to actually make it happen. And here Nikki says, when we first meet with clients, we like to point out strengths and see as we go through the intake and screening process. Using questions to support self-efficacy at Seymour, all very great. And I think the action stage, as much as it's often the time we as supporters or providers or people who are helping folks, we like to be in that state because we see things happening. There's tangible evidence of things moving in the right direction. But always remember that this is the stage where it takes a tremendous amount of energy from that person. So we have to be conscientious to provide the support and to be tolerant and to be compassionate, because this is the stage where people are really putting a lot of energy in and they need your support to ensure that it happens. So skill building, social support, and helping people understand how they think, feel, and behave. So the interventions for the maintenance stage, we talk about planning, recovery lifestyles, and social support. So in the recovery stage, the person is trying to maintain those positive behaviors that is getting them to their goal, or helping them maintain where they are in terms of goal attainment. So we're talking about critically about what it is it going to take? What kind of supports, what kind of sustained skills, what kind of action is going to take to help that person stay in that behavior that actually helps them maintain where they are. So we're talking about relapse prevention for those specific to substance use disorder and mental illness. In terms of the folks potentially from supported employment, we're talking about what keeps you at work, what keeps you benefiting from that work engagement, what helps you sustain that financial benefit of work, that social benefit of work, that emotional benefit of work, and who, in terms of the people that can help support you, that provide you with that validation, that sense of peer support to ensure that you stay in that state of benefit or that state of work, but in Patricia's case. So this is the element of truly understanding the stages of change and ensuring that when you are engaging with your clients around service provision, you're ensuring that you are working within the confines, within the guidelines of those stage-specific interventions, so that you are not trying to basically demand that someone who is still in contemplation actually act as though they're in change. So you are not, a classic example would be, you're not trying to tell someone who is in contemplation about the skills that they need to work on, because that would not be congruent with the stages of change that they're in. They need education and outreach. So it's important to make sure that you're aware that sometimes when you find yourself struggling with, particularly if you're seeing that that person does not appear to be moving as quickly or as substantially as they should towards their goal, it is critical to ask yourself, are you working within the appropriate intervention set for that stage of change? Are you trying to push that person beyond where they're ready to be? Or is that person aware or not aware as to where they are in the stages of change and what kind of interventions you need to use to really give them some insight so they can fully understand what they need to do next? So from identified goals to the KSR, and I will hand this over to Emily so that she can move us along the knowledge, skills, and resources.
Thank you, Earl. I heard KSR and I'm like, oh, I think that's me.
Indeed.
So before I get started, I just want to say, I'm so happy to be back with all of you in Washington. I do thoroughly enjoy doing trainings for all of you Washingtonians, as I fondly call you all in my own life. And I loved Washington when I got to go out there when I was in Spokane. So very happy to be back and working with all of you. So from identified goals to the KSR, right? So last week, Shelley gave us a really good overview of this idea of the assessment, right? This comprehensive assessment, its focus is really on looking at goal identification, right? And looking at these other pieces of goal identification, like determining valued life roles, looking at unmet needs, and looking at strengths, okay? From there, we have this idea of determining readiness in the stage of change, which Earl just gave you all lots and lots of wonderful information about, because we do want to explore interests, right? We want to figure out why this person is potentially interested in whatever this goal is, right? Because that could potentially be a motivating factor, okay? And then once we gather all of this information, once we get all of these pieces, now we can start looking at knowledge, skills, and resources, okay? So every single goal that anybody has, excuse me, is always going to come back to knowledge, skills, or resources, okay? And what you want to do, ideally, is collaborate with the person in order to differentiate between what their current knowledge, skills, and resources are, okay, which is then going to be their strengths, and then what knowledge, skills, and resources they might need in order to meet their goal. Okay. Which is this idea of the unmet need. Okay. So as I said, any goal, and I always challenge anybody to find a goal that does not come down to a knowledge, skill, or resource. I bet you can't, right? Everything comes back to some kind of knowledge, learning some kind of piece of information, learning a skill, or obtaining or acquiring some kind of resource. Okay. Once we have these knowledge, skills, and resources, then the person is better prepared in order to work on their goal because they have all of the information that they need, right? They know what their strengths are, and then they know the knowledge, skills, and resources that they have, and then they know which ones that they need. Now, we have identified an actual process for developing this. And for those of you who may have attended a Golden Thread training in the past, I personally think that this is a really great process. I know it's not always applicable. I know that you all have so much time. Just kidding. I know you don't. But it's time well spent to go through this process, and I'm going to outline it all for you. Okay. So before we do that though, okay, I just want to touch upon this idea of goal achievement. Okay. Because knowledge, skills, and resources, they're all about helping the person to achieve that goal, right? But we know that there are sometimes barriers to being able to achieve a goal, okay? Lack of goal-related knowledge, goal-related skills deficits, and lack of needed resources, right? That's where this idea of a goal always coming back down to knowledge, skills, and resources comes from, okay? But in order to overcome these barriers, right, we can attain knowledge, we can learn skills, and we can acquire resources. Okay. So think about it. If you think about like a general goal, like a fitness goal, because I'm taking things easy today. Okay. If your goal is to become more physically fit, and by doing that, you want to learn some kind of form of exercise, right? You're not going to be able to do that unless you have maybe weights, right? Or a kettlebell. You also might need to learn how to use that kettlebell properly. And that could be through the knowledge piece of something, right? So actually learning how to use it and then doing that repetition and developing it into a skill, right? It all comes down to knowledge, skills, and resources. So knowledge looks at what does the person need to know. Skills is what does the person need to do. And resources is what does the person need to have. Okay. So the process that I'm going to outline for all of you, and I'm going to show you an example of this, which reminds me, I need to make sure I share my sound. It's a 3-step process. Okay. The first piece of this process is to brainstorm. And when you're brainstorming, again, you're collaborating to create a list of what is necessary to achieve the goal. Okay. Everything that is necessary to achieve the goal. Okay. Not just what they need. And I really want to highlight this idea of this brainstorming process, because I know that when I would do this process with individuals, sometimes I would inadvertently make assumptions about skills that I assumed the person might have. Or I would make assumptions about knowledge that the person might have. And it wasn't until I did this brainstorming process that I realized that, oh, this person doesn't know how to, use a stove in a safe manner. This person doesn't know that you need to, wring the mop out after every time, after a couple of like swishes on the floor, right? Those are things that I think I took for granted because it was just information that I knew. It was just skills that I already knew how to do. And I was under the assumption, which is very naive of me, that everybody else knew that, but that's not always the case. Has anybody ever made assumptions about like a consumer and you just kind of assumed they knew something, or they knew how to perform a skill, or they might have had a resource, and then you were very pleasantly surprised to figure out that they didn't? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Gina. Yeah, it happens. And we're not bad people, right? We're human beings. But that's why this brainstorming process can be really helpful, because we're not just looking at what the person might need. Right. You assumed that your client knew how to use Craigslist, right? Like using the internet. Absolutely, Susan, right? That they haven't, you would think, Gina, that they had an ID. I don't even get me started on getting people IDs out here in New Jersey when they're in the state hospital. I don't even want to get started on that. But yeah, it's very easy to kind of assume that people have these different resources, knowledge, and skills, but they don't. And if we assume that they are at like a midpoint in this goal attainment process, but they need to obtain all these knowledge, skills, and resources, they might be starting back a little bit farther than what we're thinking. Okay. So brainstorming is a really, really good time to have a conversation with the person and really get an idea of where they're at. Okay. Once you brainstorm, then you can categorize. Okay. Then you're going to identify whether or not something is a knowledge, a skill, or a resource. Okay. And for resources, I'll say this for all of them. It is important to determine whether or not something is a knowledge, skill, or resource. Okay. Face value. A resource might look like a resource. Okay. Something like, if we use Gina's example of getting an ID. Okay. An ID you would very much think is a resource. Okay. Oh, thank you, Nikki. I just want to highlight what Nikki put in the chat, that if a client is receiving support from DSHS, the cost of an ID is $5 for all of you out there. Thank you very much for that information, Nikki. So if you're looking at something like getting an ID, okay, that very much looks like a resource, but there might be knowledge and skills that go into that resource. Okay. So you might have a client, a consumer, who knows this process, right? They know how to get in touch with DSHS and get an ID. I don't know what the process is out in Washington to get an ID, but like in New Jersey. Okay. So thank you, Janelle, I think you have to get a voucher from DSHS for it to be $5. Okay. So let's say the consumer's like, yeah, I know, I just have to contact DSHS and I'll get a voucher and that'll help me, in order to get my ID for $5. Okay. They know the cost. They know how to contact DSHS. They can do it all by themselves. Then yes, that ID is just going to be a resource. Okay. But if that person doesn't know how to get in touch with DSHS, then that could potentially be a skill, right? It could potentially be a communication skill. If they have to do some internet research, going back to Susan, right? But the person isn't familiar with how to use the internet, that could also be a skill, right? Or maybe even they know how to use the internet, they know how to call DSHS, but they don't have the knowledge. They're not sure what to ask for or how to ask or where to navigate on the internet. Right. Stacy, you worked with someone that had a car but didn't know how to drive, right? Absolutely. So there are certain things that are going to come up in this conversation that could very much be a knowledge, skill, and a resource. And through the categorization process, you can really figure out which one it is. Is it something that is just going to be knowledge right now? Is it something that's going to be a skill in the future? Or maybe it's just a resource. All right. And then finally, we have this idea of assessment. So in order to assess, you're going to work together to determine preparedness. And this makes a lot more sense once I give you all the form. Earl, if you want to put the link to the form in the chat box, please. But the form that we're going to share with you has a box at the end that you can then check off with the person, or the person can check off in terms of whether or not they need help with the skill. Maybe they need help learning the skill. Maybe they have some practice with the skill, but they need more, or they just don't know the skill. Same thing with resources, and same thing with knowledge. Yeah, same thing with knowledge. Okay. So this is the process for developing knowledge skills and exploring knowledge skills and resources. Okay. So you brainstorm to collaborate to create this list. You then categorize to determine what's knowledge, what's skill, and what's a resource. And then you assess to determine whether or not this is something you're going to be working with them on, right? Because if they already have the knowledge, skill, or resource, then that's what their strength is, right? And they're not going to need your support. If they need the knowledge, if they need to learn the skill, and if they need the resource, then that could potentially be something that you're going to work with them on. Okay. And I'm just going to keep letting you all discuss the ID thing in the chat box, because I think it's an important conversation for you all to have. So go ahead with your bad selves. All right. So I want to show you all the role play. But before I do that, I actually do just want to show the KSR form really quickly. Only because it is something that is highlighted in the role play. And I just want to make sure that it's clear to you all what it is before I show you the role play. So very briefly, this is what the knowledge, skill, and resources form looks like. And this is where it is. If you click on the link that Earl just put in the chat box, thank you very much, Earl, this is what you're going to see. Okay. So you have a space to put the goal, and then you have some boxes, and this is a Word document, so you all can make it bigger if needed. So you would put what the knowledge is here, you would put what the skills are here, and you would put the resources here. Okay. And then you would check off for knowledge, whether or not they have a good understanding of this, if they have some understanding of this, but need more information, or if they need education in this area. Same thing for skills. I can perform the skill whenever I need to. I have this skill, but I need practice. I need to learn this skill. And then for resources, whether they have the resource or they don't have the resource. Okay. So there's no real space to brainstorm and categorize here. What we suggest people do is, in the times when we were actually meeting with people in person, I'm not sure if you all are meeting with anybody in person. I know some of our agencies in New Jersey are starting to meet with people in person, but we would always suggest people print this out. And on the back, since it's blank, that's where you would do your brainstorming and your categorizing. So you write down everything that you needed, all the knowledge, skills, and resources. And then once you develop this list and thoroughly brainstormed, then next to each one, you would write whether it was a knowledge, skill, or resource. And then from there, you would flip it over and then put it in each of these little boxes and on the lines. Okay. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint again, and I'm going to share my audio. Look in the chat. Okay. So this is a semi-short video. I'm going to be, okay. Hold on one second. I gotta share the right thing. So I'm going to be honest with you. I star in this video. Just kidding. Not really. That is me and my former colleague, Zakia. And we developed this video as a way to show you all how to do this knowledge, skills, and resource process in terms of brainstorming, categorizing, and assessing. Okay. So it's about almost 8 minutes. But I want you guys to just watch the video, get a feel for the process, and then we're going to do some practice together. Okay. And here we go. If you guys can't hear the video, please let me know. Okay.
Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm doing well, Zakia. How are you?
Good. So I just wanted to follow up because I know last week when we met and started talking about some of the goals that you want to work on, you talked a little bit about 2 different things. One was cooking, and the other one was going back to school. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that and start to plan out the steps for your IRP.
I think that sounds great. I was really thinking about it, and I definitely want to pursue going back to school, but I also really want to learn how to cook.
Yeah. It's a really important skill, especially since you just moved in. What are some things that you're interested in learning how to cook? What types of foods?
Well, I'm vegetarian, so that limits some food items that I can eat. So I just made the change for health reasons, and I'm not really sure what are good foods to eat to maintain a healthy diet but still not eat meat products.
So it sounds like you're really focusing on your nutrition, and so learning how to cook healthier items would really contribute to your wellness that you're really trying to incorporate into your life.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I've used in the past is something called a knowledge skill resource form. And that really could give me or us a better idea as to things that you're already doing, skills that you already have in terms of cooking, and areas that maybe we can include on the IRP. Would you be open to having a conversation? And the KSR is actually right here. I brought it with me, and we could fill it out together.
Absolutely.
So the first thing, before we even look at the form, is I just wanted to brainstorm just some ideas of what you think are steps or things that anybody would need to either know, skills that you would need to do, or maybe even resources or items that you might need if you're preparing to cook.
So I definitely think I would need recipes because I'm not really good at looking at a set of ingredients and just putting them together off of the top of my head. So I would need some structure with that. I would need the food listed in the recipes, which is good because the recipes are a great guide. That's why I like to use them. I actually love to read, so maybe even a cookbook.
That's a really good idea. And I'm sure some of the cookbooks will have recipes in it as well.
Absolutely.
I know you just moved in. Can I provide some suggestions to you? I know when I first moved in my place, one of the things that was helpful for me, because I like to bake, measuring cups.
Yeah. I don't think I
measuring spoons.
Yeah, I don't think I got that.
What about measurements? I know sometimes that can be confusing for me. So whether they use the abbreviations TSP versus
TBS.
Yeah.
I never know which is which.
Exactly. So would that go along with the terminology?
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely have that in. I was also gonna say, and I don't know if this necessarily is a huge piece of this, but food items like vegetables tend to go bad quickly. So I definitely would have to manage my time so that when I'm purchasing the food items, everything stays fresh and nothing goes bad.
That's a really good idea. All right, so we have a list of 11 items. So that's the brainstorming process. So now that we have that, we're going to flip it around to the actual form, and you'll see here that it's broken down into 3 different categories, whether it's a knowledge, skill, or resource. And so with that, what I would say is if we can go through all of the items and try to decide if what we listed either falls into the knowledge, what you need to know category, whether it's a skill, something that you need to be able to do, or if it's a resource, something that you need to have in order to accomplish your goal of learning how to cook. So the first one is recipes. Do you think that's a knowledge, skill, or resource?
I would say it's a resource.
The next one?
So food items I would say is also a resource.
Okay.
The cookbook is a resource. Actually, these two could probably go together.
Yeah, so we can keep it as a resource for now. I do want to go back to food items too. I see that you put it as a resource, and I agree with that. Do you think it also could be something that you need to know as far as what food items you might need for a recipe?
Yeah, because I can't just go to the store and pick anything.
Yeah.
I have to follow the recipe, so I do need to know what food items to purchase.
And you'll see sometimes as we go through this that some of the items might fall into 2 categories, but that's fine. So the last part of what we're going to do for today, because I know you have to run out, is looking at whether you have a good understanding or have the particular resource we have listed, if you have an understanding but you need a little bit more assistance, or if it's something that maybe you're not aware of at all, or a resource that you just need to acquire that you don't have. So if we go through each of the items, so food items, knowing what food items you would need for a recipe, is that something that you have a good understanding of, you have somewhat of an understanding but need education, or you really, could benefit from some support in that area?
I think I could really benefit from some support in that area.
So let's just put an X or a check there.
Okay.
Terminology and abbreviations.
I need a lot of help with that.
Okay. That's great. And so what I do want to point out, though, is that all of these items over here, where we have need more education, need to learn the skill, or need to acquire the resource, we can take a look at that the next time I come over to really see if those are steps that we can outline on the IRP. But look what you're already starting with. So you already know how to budget, you're already paying your rent on time, and I know from visiting with you over the last couple of weeks, you do seem to have enough food, and you're able to go grocery shopping. You do use coupons sometimes, which is really good.
Yeah.
And luckily, a family member gave you pots and pans.
Mm-hmm.
So those are really all strengths that can really help and contribute to achieving the goal of cooking. So
thank you so much, Zakia.
No
this was
problem.
really helpful.
Okay, so that was our little role play of how to complete this brainstorming, categorizing, and assessing process. So as I get the PowerPoint back up, I just want to ask you all, what did you all think of this process? And I want to check in and ask, is this knowledge, skills, and resources process of brainstorming, categorizing, and assessing, is it making sense to you all? So give me some feedback here. So are you saying you would like to move the brainstorming into the form, or are you asking me to, I guess is what I'm wondering. All right, so I'm getting some yeses that it makes sense. Okay, Nikki, cool. You guys are thinking it's going to be very helpful. It makes sense. Okay. All right, and I'm happy. I see. You like the concept of using the brainstorming to fill in the form. Absolutely. That it would help target strengths and weaknesses. Yes, I like how it breaks. Yeah. And I think that that's why I personally also very much like this process. One, to your point, Natalie, about it tying everything together. It really, it's almost a logical process. It makes something almost that can be very like messy in terms of figuring out knowledge, skills, and resources. Oh my gosh, what do we need? It can be very overwhelming, right, to figure all this stuff out. It puts it, I think, in a very logical process and a nice step-by-step process. And it does very much break things down, which is very, very helpful. So I appreciate your feedback in that. And Lisa, absolutely. Lisa and Lori. So yes, it definitely has this idea of the client involvement. And absolutely, Dan, that was going to be my next point. You're reading my mind, right? If this is somebody who you're going to be working with for some time, you can 100% keep this form. And you can use it for a couple of different ways. I'm not sure if you all out in Washington have had this experience, but I've had a personal experience with a consumer that I used to work with who, at the end of the 6-month period, when we would review the IRP, which is what we use a individualized rehabilitation plan out here in New Jersey, but the treatment plan that we use, right? At the end of the 6-month mark, they'd be like, oh, I don't remember working. I don't know why I even wanted to work on these goals. I don't know what's happening. And I'd pull out the form and I'd be like, but we talked about this. This is the form where we outlined everything, right? This is where you said you had this knowledge and where you didn't have this skill. And that's kind of how this, process happened. And they remembered after that. So it's good for that instance, but I think it's also good in terms of progression, and looking at something that could potentially be a knowledge for one treatment plan could then be just attaining a resource at the next treatment plan. It could be a skill, and then it could be attaining a resource. And yes, absolutely, Cameron, it does really engage the client through each and every step, and keeps them involved in the process, which is, especially good for those individuals that don't necessarily want to engage with us. I think the wellness worksheet that Shelly introduced to all of you last week is a really, really good engagement tool. And this knowledge, skills, and resources process is also an engagement tool. Yep, and empowers them to drive the process. Absolutely, Sharna. Yeah, and they are really in the driver's seat in this, right? Because you're just kind of writing things down. You're maybe asking some prompting questions. Absolutely, Cameron, it really does promote self-sufficiency. But yeah, it really is a good process. So I want to keep it moving a little bit, because I want to make sure that we get to the activity. We are going to go into a breakout group. I know we always get mixed feedback about breakout groups, but you can do this next activity on your own or by yourself. On your own or with a partner. Okay. So this is how you could potentially do the brainstorming process online. Just taking a goal, like taking medication. And these are all the things that might go into that goal. Okay. So you might need to know the names of the medication, the pill size and or the color, how often to take each pill, how to store different medications, filling the pill box, calling the pharmacy, setting an alarm, right? And then you need an alarm, right? If you're going to set an alarm, you need medications, you need the pill box. Okay. And then I was going to do some group practice here. Oh, you're very welcome, Andy. Thank you. I try not to get offended if people leave because of the breakout groups. I've been a participant in trainings too, and I know I don't necessarily like them myself at times, but we do want to give you all an opportunity to practice. If this was in a live training, it would be a lot easier, but it's not. It's online. So we do need to give you all an opportunity to practice and then come back and discuss, and that's where the breakout groups come in. But thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. So we did kind of build in some time here to do some practice, but I actually would rather give you all some time to do this and practice the actual activity. So I'm just going to skip over this and go to this actual activity. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Earl again to put the directions in the chat box. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'm going to pull up the directions. So I'm going to go over the directions with you all briefly, but the directions have everything you need to know on them. Okay. So again, if you click on the link, this is what is going to pop up. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through this process of brainstorming, categorizing, and assessing. Okay. So I'm going to put everybody into a group of 2. If you're unable to work with your partner for whatever reason, if they're not answering, if there's an issue, definitely come back and send me a message and I'll try to help out. Earl is definitely going to put it in the chat, Cameron. Thank you. But the directions have this information as well as the knowledge, skill, and resource form. Okay. So what I want you all to do is, if you can, work with a partner. We're giving you guys 30 minutes. We're giving you guys a lot of time to do this activity. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm like, why? Oh, I'm sorry, Ina. I'm sorry you have to leave. That's okay. So we're giving you guys 30 minutes because we want you to work with a partner and we want you to each have the opportunity. So Link put it in, Earl put the link in the chat box. Wow. And that's okay. No worries. No worries. Everybody's saying that you guys have to leave. That's okay. But I do ask that if people are going to leave, if you do leave before I do finish going over these directions, only because I don't want to put you all in a breakout group if you're not going to be able to participate in the activity. Okay. But thank you all. So we're going to give you guys 30 minutes. Okay. So one person is going to be a counselor. The other person is going to be the participant. Okay. The counselor is going to use engagement strategies to collaborate with the participant to think of a goal. That could be very quick. Okay. And then we're going to ask you to take 5 minutes to do the brainstorming piece, 5 minutes to categorize, and 5 minutes to assess. Okay. This is not how much time you would do this in person. You would take a lot more time to do this. But for the purpose of this activity, we're going to do 5 minutes for each. Okay. I'm going to send out a, whatchamacallit. I'm going to send out a reminder every 5 minutes so you guys know what the 5 minute mark is. But you guys are going to have 15 minutes for the person to be the counselor and the other person be the participant. After the 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a reminder to switch. And then the person who was the participant is then going to be the counselor. The person who was the counselor is now going to be the participant, and you're going to do the same exact thing. You're going to think of a goal. You're going to do the brainstorming for 5 minutes, the categorizing for 5 minutes, and then assessing for 5 minutes. At that point, we're going to bring you all back. Okay. If you are not going to be participating in a breakout group, just don't enter the breakout group. Okay. There's honestly too many of you for me to be able to differentiate between who is and who isn't, which is why unfortunately, I'm not able to ask people to let me know that. But just don't click on the message when you get it to actually go into the breakout group. Okay. So if you are finished before 30 minutes, Sharnai, then and you're working on your own, do another goal. Okay. Try to do another goal, try to practice, but if you're working with a partner, you should really spend the 15 minutes, as much time as you can, going through this process, working with another person. Okay. Because the more practice you have doing this, the easier it's going to be. If you've done this before, it might be a little bit different, but if this is a new process to you, I definitely suggest you taking the full 30 minutes. And if you're working by yourself, again, think of a goal, go through this process of brainstorming, categorizing, and assessing. And what I suggest you do is really think about how you can work with an individual on this, how you can work with any of one of your consumers using this tool, and how this could potentially be applicable to them. Okay. So before I put you all into the breakout groups, does anybody have any questions? And was everybody able to click on the link? Because if you do not click on the link, then you are not going to be able to. Okay. I'm going to put the link back in the chat, or I'll put it in a little bit ago. This to everybody. Okay, so that is the link. Once you click on it, you should see exactly what I'm seeing. All right, so I am going to put you all into the breakout groups then, and let's get it started. Okay. And I'm going to stop recording. Oh, you know what? I want to stop the recording. So I'm going to resume the recording. And I'm so disappointed. I'm so sorry for all of you. So I want to ask you all, what are you thinking here? What did you guys think of the activity? For those of you who did it with a partner and were able to complete the activity with a partner, what was your process as the counselor? What was your process as the participant? For those of you who did the activity individually, what was that like? Were you able to sort of imagine and envision yourself doing this activity and doing this process with a consumer? So what's your feedback? Feel free to put it in the chat, unmute yourself. Tell me what you got. And I will give you all some time to, oh, Charnay, you're still working. Okay, thank you, Charnay. I'm happy you like it. I'm hoping that the practice and working through the process was helpful. So Susan, yes, it's so hard to come up with a goal on the spot, but it's helpful, I think, if you come up with your own goal than for me to just give you a goal, but I might have to rethink that because I get how that could potentially be challenging and could take up a little bit of time. But luckily, when you actually start doing this process with an individual, they will already have a goal. So you won't have to do a lot of legwork once you get to this form in terms of developing one. And yeah, Charnay, absolutely. And let me know if you all agree with this statement that it helps identify all the pieces of a goal. And that's honestly why I liked using this when I was still working in the field, because you forget a lot of things. It's very easy to forget. And then you're midway through a treatment plan and you're like, oh, I now have to provide this intervention and I don't know how to bill for this intervention because it's not on the treatment plan. So I do really believe that this form and breaking it down is really helpful in that. So Jan, you said on your own, you found yourself finding possible barriers to being able to get someone who could be resistant to inpatient treatment to uncover barriers in knowledge, skills, and resources, which open doors to understanding. So, oh, okay. Okay. So this process, I'm getting the sense you did a lot of reflection during this process, Jan, which I appreciate. Josiah, I talked through a goal and some KSR for myself and my partner, although I have a lot of this in my head, it's very helpful to put it down on paper. So I'm very quote unquote old fashioned, even though I don't think it should be old fashioned, but I am very old fashioned in the sense that I too like to put things down on paper. So I hear you on that. Richard, this is a great tool to help the patient to consider their strengths. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I don't know if this is a question that you all are encouraged to ask, but we're very strengths focused out here in New Jersey. And during our assessment process, we ask like, what are your strengths? And I can't tell you how many times I asked somebody that question and they were like, I don't know. I mean, if someone asked me that question, I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea what my strengths are, right? It's very hard to come up with that by yourself because it's a vague question depending on where you're asking and how you're asking it. But through this form, everything is on paper, what the person's strengths are. So thank you for that. Oh, nice. So you, C. Fisher, who are you? What is your first name? Unless I can just call you C. I can call you C. Oh, Cameron, thank you. Okay, because I'm like, C. Fisher. So Cameron, you said this was a great exercise. You got a lot out of it. I was pretending I had a problem and actually ended up discussing something that I want to address. It made you think. I like that, right? Because you can almost, and this is something I do almost want to caution people against. You can really go down a rabbit hole with this form. You can really just keep coming up with knowledge, skills, and resources and really breaking things down. So you do have to kind of be careful with how much you actually do want to break things down and what is actually, helpful to the person and where they're at. So that definitely is something to consider. But I'm happy it led you to actually getting to something that you want to address with yourself, Cameron. So that's also awesome. Jesse, you were able to work by yourself and no one disagreed with my goal, although I had problems thinking about resources. yes, it's nice when you're working on your own and no one's like, hey, that's, I don't know. Do you want to work on that goal, Jesse? So that's nice. And the resources are hard. But also a good, and I'm happy you brought this up because I don't think I mentioned this before. Some goals don't need resources, because again, like it really is dependent on how you want to look at something. Because maybe you're just not looking maybe you're not looking at it as a resource, but maybe if you were working with a consumer on this and the roles were kind of reversed, maybe when they're explaining it to you, you might be like, oh, that's a resource. Or maybe they might be like, oh, this is a resource. So it really does, I think, depend on your perspective and how you're looking at it, but something might not necessarily need a resource. So Josiah, the assessment piece is actually what you would do here with these checkoff boxes. So once you have the knowledge piece, and I'll use the fitness example again. So the goal is I'm going to, let's say somebody wants to lose 10 pounds. I know I'm not really using a challenging example here, but you guys got to bear with me. So the person's going to lose 10 pounds over the next 6 months. So they might need to know nutritious recipes, maybe recipes with more fruits and vegetables. They might need workout equipment as a resource. And then the skill might be actually using that workout equipment. Okay. In the assessment piece, what you're going to do is determine where they're at with that piece of knowledge. Okay. So in terms of nutritious recipes or recipes with more fruits and vegetables, do they have a good understanding of this? Do they have some understanding of this, but they need more information, or do they need education on this area? Okay. If you're working with the consumer and the consumer says, well, I have no idea what recipes to use for this, then you would check off, I need education in this area. And that could potentially be something you're going to work on with the person. Okay. In terms of skills with using maybe how to use a kettlebell, that could be a skill, right? Using a kettlebell. And the person might say, no, I've used kettlebells in the past. So then you would mark down that they can perform the skill whenever they need to. And then in terms of the resource, right? Maybe they know how to use a kettlebell, but they just don't have a kettlebell, right? Kind of the opposite of the person who mentioned that one of their consumers had a car, but they didn't know how to drive it, right? So you would check off that they already have that resource. Okay. Does that make sense, Josiah? And then there's kind of a piece after this form that we're going to go over in about 30 seconds. Okay, awesome. And then is it Treza? You said Susan did a great job using this as a tool to categorize my KSR and pointing out my strengths. Yeah. And you always want to point out the strengths and you want to be very, very specific and say, hey, this is a strength. You already have this. Because it's such an overwhelming process sometimes to try to work on a goal and have all these moving parts and all these moving pieces to it. So I always personally was very, very specific about hey, remember when you said you didn't know what strengths you have? This is all the knowledge that you have. These are all the skills that you have. These are all the resources that you have. And that's why it's so important when you're doing that brainstorming piece that you go over both, whether they have it or not, even if the person's like, oh, but I already know how to cook. It doesn't matter. Let's just put it down on the paper. And then once you get to this piece, it's look, this is your strength. It's wonderful. Okay. And then Cameron, yeah, sometimes the thing itself might even be the resource, just such as love for oneself and others. We're getting very philosophical this morning, and I appreciate that. I really do. But yes, absolutely. Okay. So let's keep it moving. Okay. Hold on one second. All right. So the last piece of this is how we get from the knowledge, skills, and resources to the ISP. Okay. So we start out with this idea of the goal. Okay. And the goal is developed using the assessment. Okay. From the goal, we have this idea of the objective, okay? And the objective really looks at this idea of unmet needs identified on the knowledge, skill, and resource, okay? So the strengths are those things that the knowledge, skills, and resources that the person already has. The objectives on this ISP are the knowledge, skills, and resources that the person needs, okay? And this is your buy-in. This is when you're working with the person, okay? Ugh, it always does that. Next, we have strengths, right? And that's the knowledge, skills, and resources that the consumer already has. And then finally, we have this ISP. And I'm not going to go any further with the ISP because that's really where we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks. But this is kind of the first pieces of it, right? You have the goal from the assessment, the objective, which is the unmet needs identified on the KSR, and then the strengths, which are the knowledge, skills, and resources that the consumer already has, okay? So Susan, you said, what if I'm assuming you're saying, what if they need motivation? So that is going to come in more when we talk about interventions. And kind of linking back to this idea of the stages of change and making sure that you're doing stage-based motivations, and really making sure that you are basing your interventions off of the stages of change. Because if the person is more in a pre-contemplation or contemplative state of change, you're going to want to make sure the interventions are going to line up with that. And that's when you're going to use some motivational interviewing. Okay. So Earl, if you could please put the evaluation in the chat box. So next week, we're going to be starting to look at the ISP before we get into like the nuts and the bolts. We're going to look first at the SMART framework. Okay. I'm going to be presenting next week on that. Earl's going to be providing me some support. And for next week, we want you to do a learning application. You know, we always want you to do a learning application. So for the next training on May 13th, we want you to review a service plan that you already have developed with somebody. You all are very welcome. I appreciate the positive feedback in the chat box. Please do the evaluation and put that on the evaluation too. Thanks very much. But for next week, we want you to just review a service plan and focus on the goal and the objectives, okay? And I want you to identify whether or not the objective is related to a knowledge, skill, or resource needed to achieve the goal, okay? So look at the objective, see if it's fitting in with this idea of knowledge, skills, and resources, and figure out which one it is. Is it knowledge, is it skill, or is it a resource, okay? Even if that wasn't the process that you used or the person used to develop that treatment plan, okay? And I'll put the evaluation. Thank you again all for your fantastic participation, as Earl said. I want to reiterate that. And that's it. We have questions. We have about 2 minutes left. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Thank you all for staying for the full 2 hours. This is a 2-hour training, just so that everybody knows. So every week we are going to meet for 2 hours. But I hope you all found this helpful. Thank you all for your participation and for being supportive of us and, you know, listening to our spiel. Thank you all so much. I'm actually going to stop the recording.